Hi, welcome to our presentation on securing complex applications. We're going to be talking about primarily the Okta Access Gateway and best practices panel with a lot of our GSIs and partners. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Adrianne Ward. I'm the Director for Alliances and Commercial Presales. I interact with a lot of our partners on a daily basis, so this is a great time and a great chance for them to tell you about some of the best practices that they've learned from the field. Some of the key applications that we're actually going to be focusing on today are the Oracle E-Business Suite, Oracle for PeopleSoft, SAP, and SharePoint. These are some of the most complex applications that we see within the enterprise, and a lot of our partners have extensive benefits and extensive usage of these applications as we start integrating them with Okta. Our panel today has over 110 years experience in the field, which is excellent if you want to get some really great use cases and get some great information and best practices. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So Brent, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, I'm Brent Wissbrod with Accenture's security team. I've been focused on identity and access management for about the past 15 years. I'm currently our Okta practice lead and have oversight on all of our Okta deployments across North America.
Thanks, Brent. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself today?
Sure, thank you, Adrian. I'm Martin G. I'm the CTO and founder of ICSynergy. Have been in the security space for roughly 25 years. Started doing this stuff long before we call it the web and they had real products. I have extensive experience with Okta for the last 6 years and kind of hybrid deployment models, specifically with OAG and products like that.
Awesome, thanks, Martin. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, so I am a cybersecurity manager at Deloitte with over 7 years of experience, primarily focusing on Okta deployments. Started Okta deployments about 4 years ago and have extensive experience with integrating Okta's applications and on-premise applications as well.
Oh, awesome. Thanks, Stephen. So Vishnu couldn't make it today, but we have Narsi on the line from PwC. Narsi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm primarily an access management expert for over 10 years now, and of late, I'm overseeing all the Okta implementations which are going through from a technical perspective within PwC.
Awesome. Thanks, Narsi. All right. Thanks, guys. We're going to start talking about the most popular complex applications that many of our enterprises see today, and we're going to start talking now about Oracle E-Business Suite. So, Martin G., we're going to talk about what kind of security and compliance requirements do we typically see with Oracle E-Business?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think if you kind of look at a broad security space, really single sign-on is one of the things that will help customers achieve, not having to use passwords and doing password resets. So that's one of the easy kind of low-hanging items. More complex things like user lifecycle management can be streamlined through Okta as well. And so that's obviously a real important thing as users are logging into the Okta service. They need to pair with users in the EBS application itself. So we need to understand how we're going to synchronize and the lifecycle of those users with common sources like Workday and things like that Okta does really well. And MFA is another real popular item these days, just to kind of get that extra layer of security and making sure the actual users that are touching your EBS system, which EBS is typically, the crown jewels of your organization. Multi-factor is a huge kind of no-brainer with Okta.
Do you see more and more organizations trying to use Okta SSO and MFA for protecting that EBS today, considering all the security concerns that are going on in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just one of the big ones, obviously, which we're subject to, since we're all remote today, is how do I get into my applications that are on-premise remotely in a secure way, right? So obviously, I think we've all seen Hackerville has started, and everybody knows people are at home and people are getting phished and all kinds of things. So, MFA is just the gold standard for how we're going to expose internal applications out to the internet, out to people at home. And then obviously the SSO, which I mentioned as well, is, having a simple way to, with the Okta service, kind of providing adaptive authentication, more complex ways that users get into the Okta service translate to better security to applications such as EBS.
So without Okta and the Okta Access Gateway, what alternatives do customers have for protecting that EBS?
Yeah, I mean, there are some classic, and I'll do air quotes on that, classic implementations out there with Oracle apps, Oracle Access Manager, and products such as that. That's primarily the most popular kind of way that people are doing that. Alternatively, people are using VPNs, right? Whereas in the first scenario, these kind of old WAM products are really coming out of favor just because of the cost and the flexibility that they do not offer. And then adding on the things that Okta can do very easy, like adaptive MFA and MFA, are big efforts for these products. So coming full circle on this, the alternatives, which the last alternative I talked about was just using VPNs, which is not a favorable model because it leads to a lot of help desk complexity, and then also exposes a lot of times the internal network to bigger surface areas in case there is an issue with hacking.
Yeah, how are the key milestones and gotchas of securing EBS with Okta? How do we get through those?
The first thing is to really understand the EBS environment itself. So just over the course of the 15, 20 years, people have implemented SSO with EBS. So those are things that we might be replacing. Also, there might be EBS systems that are just deployed in various ways where they might have a centralized LDAP or they're synchronizing with Active Directory. So beyond the obvious security requirements, we definitely need to understand the architecture of the system. From there, obviously, then we can move into the requirements, and so so to get Okta integrated with Okta Access Gateway with EBS is understanding the two different models that you might use to integrate with EBS. One is what we call the classic model, where customers do have OID, access gates, and things like that in play. So that would be more appropriate for swapping out an existing system with maybe that OEM is providing. And then there's also what we call the rapid model, where there is not a lot of infrastructure requirement, but that's kind of a lighter weight integration model with the Okta Access Gateway. So once we kind of understand those two things, one of the other most important milestones is, which I talked about earlier, was synchronizing the IDs. So understanding how your Okta users marry to the ABS users. So that might be, it might be as simple as, hey, we just synchronize Okta to AD, and we kind of take for granted that the EBS users are using the AD user, email or something like that. If that's not the case, then we need to come up with a way of keeping those in sync. And then, so once we kind of understand those scenarios, then it really comes down to just deployment. The deployment actually doesn't take that long, and the exercising the use cases isn't that big of a deal, getting your test cases. But those three things are primarily the most important parts of a deployment.
When we're looking at the EBS system, what type of security and compliance requirements do organizations typically have?
So the drivers, from the CIO, CISO level, sometimes are just simple as just putting MFA on top of these things. Getting a SSO in place so that when users are added to Active Directory into an organization, or they're removed, then their access is turned off. So typically the requirements are the compliance requirements are simple. It's MFA and user lifecycle management. Just turns out that SSO helps you achieve a lot of that pretty easily as well.
Okay. When you're approaching securing an EBS with Okta, how do you do it by mitigating a lot of the risk that organizations see? Are they doing it for risk mitigation primarily, or are they doing it for overall risk, security risk?
I think it is to mitigation. Obviously there are companies that have had, bad things happen. So that a lot of times drives projects that weren't initially going to happen. But it's really risk avoidance primarily. And then, marrying, again, thinking about EBS as one of your kind of key enterprise applications, you cannot afford for that to be down, but nor can you afford someone to be hacking in it. So, what we see is a lot of times the primary applications, such as the ones that we have on this discussion, are the ones that are really important to get aligned with your risk policies and, your CISO and those types of standards.
Okay. Thanks, Martin. I appreciate your answers. So next, we're going to go to Oracle PeopleSoft, and we're going to talk to Stephen.
Hey,
so, Stephen, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So what kind of security do people usually see around PeopleSoft?
So PeopleSoft is primarily, an enterprise solution, right? That has, many different modules to it. It basically manages your revenues, your expenses, human capital, your CRM solution. So typically we see a lot of SOX requirements over this, PCI, HIPAA requirements. So we typically want to have the security controls in place and the application security controls in place, right? So we want to make sure there is appropriate access provisioning, deprovisioning, password complexity, password controls, essentially, change management, and making sure that at least at the application level, that those security requirements are being met. And then on top of that, obviously you want to have SSO and MFA for that specific application and modules.
Okay. Are you seeing more and more institutions actually implement MFA on their PeopleSoft implementations?
Absolutely. Yep. So I think a lot of it too is how often they get prompted as well. Typically what we're seeing is at least once per day. For administrators, what we're seeing to the PeopleSoft application, making sure that there's a group assigned to those administrators and making sure that those users are consistently being prompted for each authentication session.
That's good. So what key milestones and gotchas do you typically see when you're securing PeopleSoft with Okta?
Mm-hmm. So when we kind of go into first the milestone piece, right, we definitely want to make sure that we're gathering the appropriate requirements. So based upon what modules you're using within PeopleSoft, we want to make sure that, the appropriate segregation of duties is actually in place, right? The second piece of that is, when we're implementing SSO and MFA and leveraging Okta Access Gateway, for example, right? We want to make sure that we're setting the right information and essentially setting the right information within the headers, right? That's one piece. So the application can actually consume those headers and provide the right level of access. The second piece to that is making sure that local authentication is being suppressed within PeopleSoft itself. So typically what we've seen is that, if SSO essentially fails, then there's a fallback to having local authentication being available. So what we recommend essentially is to, you can write some code in the background to essentially suppress local authentication for basic users. But for privileged users, essentially, we would want to make sure that those users have kind of I want to say a backdoor in quotes, but essentially, essentially making sure that those users have MFA in front of them every time they authenticate.
How many PeopleSoft modules can you use with OAG?
So you can use all of the modules, and actually it's one integration, right? So you just have multiple endpoints to each of those modules that allows access, and so essentially they could be different bookmark applications within your Okta application.
What are the difference with integrating all the different modules if you had to do multiple modules, or is it just the one?
It's typically just the one module. So essentially, like I mentioned, you would just have different endpoints in order to do those types of integrations with OAG.
So without Okta and the OAG, what are other alternatives to protect PeopleSoft?
So some of the things that I've seen prior to OAG kind of being released was you can use a load balancer to perform, header-based authentication, or you can protect it using a radius server directly with PeopleSoft to offer MFA. You can use some type of reverse proxy to, expose it to the internet. I do not recommend that in any regard, but that is something I have seen as well. Okay.
Good non-recommendation, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much. So we're going to move on to SAP. So Brent, we're going to talk to you a little bit about SAP and protecting SAP. So when you look at SAP implementations within the organizations you work with, what are the security and compliance requirements that those organizations typically face?
SAP just has all the standard security and compliance regulations that just by default, since it's so complex and covers so many different subject areas. So you've got SOX, a lot of times HIPAA, GLBA, all of those things, since you have procurement and HR type of functions going on within SAP, and so much so that they even have their own components to help you mitigate those with their GRC component, governance, risk, and compliance piece. And they even have their own access management and governance pieces that you can deploy if you don't already have a legacy system that you're trying to protect it with.
So when you're looking at SAP implementations, how do you leverage Okta in those implementations to secure that SAP environment?
Yeah, so now with Okta, specifically with the OAG component that's available now, you can get a pretty broad coverage across the SAP component base. So SAP is very complex. I mean, there's a lot of different components that have been added and assembled over the years, different interfaces with iDocs, BAPIs, ABAP, all the different things involved with SAP. But now some of the components are supporting things like SAML. So you can, with NetWeaver, you can use Okta as the IDP from a SAML perspective. And so it's all the components that use SAML. You can start integrating those direct with Okta, but there still are some pieces that don't support the modern standards. So that's where we can plug in the gateway now and put all of the pieces that still are using the older technologies behind the gateway. And then with the combination of Okta and the gateway, you have a good single sign-on coverage across the platform.
So when you're doing implementations, what are some key areas that are gotchas you think typical customers might miss, or things that they might need to know about their projects?
I think one of the key things with SAP is that it's a very customizable platform, and enterprises have definitely taken advantage of that. So just because your peer that has maybe implemented single sign-on successfully in their SAP environment doesn't mean it's going to be the same deployment or the same integration for your organization, because you may have done several different customizations or different deployments that make yours very unique. So I think definitely adding in that analysis to figure out exactly how you're deployed, which components you have in your infrastructure, and how you're going to wire those up with Okta, and that's definitely a first step that should always be taken. And then kind of determining how deep you want to go with the functionality. So a lot of the things like NetWeaver, the things sitting behind it, those will be some of the low-hanging fruit. But there are still some organizations using some of the client applications, and then so you have to decide, am I going to go through the effort to get single sign-on down to that level, or am I happy with getting the majority of the people through the front door on just using the web-based applications?
Right. Before the Okta Access Gateway was released, what were some other ways that you saw people securing their SAP applications? And what's kind of the difference, right, in using Access Gateway to compare to the way that people were doing it?
Right. So, I mean, SAP has been around for a long time now. And when it first came out, it really didn't have its own identity and access components built into the system. So a lot of organizations were using their legacy single sign-on solution that they had in their environment and wiring that up with SAP. So you got things like Oracle, SiteMinder, etc., that had various capabilities to single sign-on enable different pieces of SAP. So organizations had some success doing that. And as SAP matured, they actually built in their own components to start enabling this function as well. So you've got things like the SAP Gateway, its own access management component, governance, etc. So some organizations chose to switch over to that capability. And there's even organizations that tried to leverage that across other systems above and beyond SAP itself. So there's quite a broad mix of how people have tackled it. But now, as more organizations are moving off their legacy platforms and moving to systems like Okta, they're able to provide a streamlined user experience. So as their organization is using Okta, they're getting used to the Okta native MFA factors, things like that. Now they're able to extend that to more of their on-prem systems, such as SAP, using the gateway. So I think from a user experience perspective, it's very valuable to get that consistent experience across all your platforms.
No, that's awesome. Thanks, Brent. So we're going to move on to SharePoint. We have Narsi from PwC. Hi, Narsi.
Hey, Adrianne.
So when we're looking at security and compliance of SharePoint applications, how are you securing those applications today?
Today, SharePoint is kind of a document repository. How complex can that get, right? But hey, that's not really the case, right? There are contracts out there. There are stuff which not everybody should have access to. There are crown jewel formulas out there in SharePoint, which is getting access from an R&D department perspective. Right now these needs those fine-grained authorizations. People need to know who has access to those key critical pieces of the information, right? Like your restricted SharePoints right now. For example, if a company has a pretty big R&D department, then where they can walk into a plant, an R&D plant with probably literally no mobile phones, and how do you kind of secure their access the documents they need to see? Now that's kind of where, from a security and compliance perspective, it becomes really critical in terms of SSO and MFA when people are trying to access SharePoint.
Okay. What type of application integrations have you done with SharePoint and Okta today?
Oh, it's pretty much the standard ones, right? That's kind of the ones which were pretty good. Now when you look at the pitfalls when you try to do a SharePoint integration, SharePoint on-prem has been on for a long time. And what huge companies have ended up doing was they have their own projects which have spin-off, and then they try to integrate with SharePoint, trying to pull data, trying to upload documents and download documents, all through programmatic calls. Right now those are the kind of the things which you have to in the discovery phase try to figure out who is doing that, and try to go figure out, hey, don't do that way. This is a standard way to do it. That way when you do the cutover to Okta, you end up not affecting those integrations.
Gotcha. So with the Access Gateway, you're able to provide a little bit better integration with that on-prem SharePoint?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And especially, the MFA piece, which we kind of, touch upon, right? So that's kind of, the key piece. Now, for example, in case you need to enable, YubiKey based authentications for people who do not have access to, say, a mobile phone, which they can't take into a plan. Now, that is where, it becomes super easy and super efficient to enable YubiKey for them, and then, boom, they're in, right? So that way you're in compliance with the governance requirements, in compliance with the capability and the compatibility with whatever the organization has set up, and that's kind of a huge selling point when it comes to enabling MFA for SharePoint.
Okay, so when we're talking about Office 365 as well, what are some of the gotchas that you've seen with securing Office 365 with Okta?
So Office is huge. Not O365, you're kind of swinging the whole Azure tenant to Okta. So one of the things people don't get right away is, okay, we go and say, hey, we'll be swinging O365, but guess what? All the other applications which are out there on Azure, like all the web applications, your dynamic CRM, whoever is using whatever is deployed on Azure, they all are going to be swinging over to Okta, right? So that's kind of very critical from a discovery perspective. When you talk to clients and tell, okay, we'll be integrating O365 Okta, hey, guess what? It is not just O365; it's everything which you have on Azure. So those are kind of the intricacies we have seen through the deployment, right? Like, for example, SQL Server integrations for the ones which are on Azure. Now, those get impacted because, you put an Okta in there, right? If you're using, on-prem accounts for authentication. So those are the things which you should be, really looking for. And the way in which, you can absolutely get through that is doing a lot of log analysis in terms of what is going on in your tenant. That way, you know what is going in and what is going out. That'll give you a pretty good picture of what you got to do.
So how quick, I know you had a really large implementation recently, Okta with Office 365. How quickly were you able to get that integration done can you give us a little bit of insight on what you did there?
Oh, absolutely right. I mean, it's pretty huge. I mean, it's a very global deployment, spanning across multiple nations and countries. And we were able to get it done in a span of 12 weeks, right? That's huge. 12 weeks to enable Okta integration for authentication and MFA is something which nobody has heard of in the organization. They were like questioning, oh, can you really get it done in 12 weeks, right? But guess what? Hey, we can absolutely do it with Okta. We were down hitting on the ground and running. Probably week 2 we were like setting up integrations and starting to test, which is very critical, right? When you're doing a huge implementation, and that's absolutely the power of the cloud, right? You don't have to book your server, set up things, get onto the cloud. And 12 weeks, we got a huge Azure tenant swing over to Okta.
Yeah. So if you weren't using Okta, what are other applications or other alternatives that you would have to do to secure those applications?
Traditionally, I have seen clients using ADFS to do it, right? That's kind of how people normally protect your O365 or your Azure tenant to do it. And ADFS, it has worked well for a few organizations, hasn't really worked for a few organizations. But traditionally, it's been ADFS, and from MFA perspective, I have seen customers use Azure MFA on top of ADFS.
Okay, thanks, Narsi. I appreciate your answers. So we're going to continue the conversation at octanelive-wham@okta.com. If you want to send an email to that address, you can. If you have any questions, you can, and we'll answer those questions. Right now, I want to thank our panelists and give them one more chance to add any additional comments that they might have. Brent, do you have any additional comments or anything you'd like to say?
No, I think we're in a very interesting time right now with a lot of companies really pushing the limits of their remote capabilities, ability to work from home. And, I think we're seeing there's going to be a lot of change coming out of this. So, we're looking forward to working with our clients, seeing how we can assist them to be prepared for things in the future, and hope everybody's staying safe out there and being well.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of that, right? We're doing Octane Live now.
Exactly.
Thanks. Martin, do you have any closing comments?
What Brent said was well said. I think we're really concerned about how everybody's doing, but I think it is going to force some interesting technology changes that we'll see over the next year or so. And I think this is going to set that precedence for real virtual work, and I think it actually may make the experience better. I'm not sure if that's good for humanity, but I think we're all going to have to learn how to work remotely better. I still like to be with people and do that, but again, I hope everybody's focusing on being safe, and we'll make the technology work and get people keep people in business. That's something we're going to try hard to do. Absolutely.
Thanks, Martin. Steven, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of echo everyone else here. And, as we're kind of moving into more of a remote workforce capacity right now, I think, instead of kind of bogging down your VPN, you can definitely use Okta as well as Okta Access Gateway to access your on-premise resources and applications in a more feasible way.
Yeah, thanks, Steven. And Narsi.
Oh, on the same spirit, right? So now there is renewed interest, right? Absolutely, from the higher ups in terms of, okay, my workforce is sitting from home and working. How secure are they, right? How secure are applications when they're trying to access these from home? I mean, not to say that it wasn't there before, but I think there's a definitely renewed interest in people trying to understand how we can secure them more.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining the panel and joining us today. There, you can actually ask questions. We're going to be accepting questions live on the Q&A panel, and there will be people present to actually answer those questions. So enter those questions and we'll answer you. So thank you, everybody, for attending the presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.